It's been 20 years since the unforgettable 2001/02 season. We witnessed so many legendary moments that occurred in the playoffs, including various game winners, a couple of record-breaking comebacks, and the most entertaining and drama-filled series that I've ever seen between the Lakers and the Sacramento Kings. That series alone deserves its own documentary. But there's one other thing that occurred that season that was a hot topic among all NBA fans. That is, if Tim Duncan truly deserved to win the MVP award over Jason Kidd. Many people, including NBA players, believe that Jason Kidd was snubbed. Remember when Shaq said this after winning the Finals MVP?
First of all, I want to say congratulations to Jason Kidd, the real MVP of the regular season.
20 years later, and it still gets debated. This makes sense because this was one of the closest MVP races of the modern era. Check out how close Jason Kidd was to winning the MVP, according to the number of first place votes he got. So this was a very close call. There's no debate that Jason Kidd was a legitimate MVP candidate. But I believe that there is no question that the voters got this one right. We'll get to that in a second. But let's first see both sides of the debate. Let's discuss why many people believe that Jason Kidd was more deserving of winning that award. The biggest thing that is brought up is the improvement that the Nets experienced when they traded Stephon Marbury for Jason Kidd. In the 2001 season, the Nets ended up with a record of 26-56. In comes J. Kidd, and the Nets improved to 52 wins in his first season there. We're talking about a 26-game improvement with the exact same core. I should mention that Kerry Kittles did miss the whole season in 2001. But let's not act like he was the reason why the Nets went from a lottery team to a championship contending team. It was all because of Jason Kidd. And isn't that what the MVP is all about? Awarding the player that was the most valuable for their team? That's the biggest piece of evidence that one can point to that proves the type of effect Jason Kidd can have on a team, especially when you consider the type of talent that was surrounding him. This wasn't a team that was stacked with talent. In fact, there wasn't a single player on the team that averaged over 15 points per game for the season. But Jason Kidd led his team to the best record in the Eastern Conference. So by his most strict definition, one can argue that no one was more valuable to its team than Jason Kidd was to the New Jersey Nets. We can also point to another all-time great point guard that won the MVP award in very similar circumstances. Remember when Steve Nash won the MVP in 2005? Jason Kidd's numbers are no different than what Steve Nash did. Nash averaged 15.5 points per game on 50% shooting, 11.5 assists per game, and 3.3 rebounds per game. Now consider Kidd's numbers. He averaged 14.7 points per game on 39% shooting, 9.9 assists per game, 7.3 rebounds per game, and 2.1 steals per game. Kidd might have been the efficient scorer that Nash was, but there's no question that Kidd was a better all-around player. Kidd was a much better rebounder, and he was leagues better on defense than Nash was. And if you remember, the primary reason that Nash won the MVP that year was that the Suns improved by 33 wins when they acquired Nash, who coincidentally also replaced Stephon Marbury. So if that was good enough for Nash to win the MVP, then why wasn't it good enough for Kidd to win it? If you're in the camp that believes that Jason Kidd should have won it that year, then you would surely bring all this up to make your case. And they're all great points. But if you believe that the talent that the Spurs had was much better than what the Nets had, then you might want to take a second look at the type of players that Duncan was surrounded with. Let's look at the roster for the 2002 San Antonio Spurs. The second leading scorer for the Spurs was David Robinson, who was 36 years old and was 1 year away from retiring from the game. He averaged only 12.2 points per game. There's no question that his biggest value came in the defensive end, and he was still one of the game's best defenders. In fact, he finished in the top 5 in defensive win shares that season, but he was no longer capable of producing big scoring numbers for his team. Then you had a past his prime Steve Smith, who averaged 11.6 points per game. Everyone else scored under double figures, including the 19-year-old Tony Parker. So let's be honest here. Is the core of a 36-year-old David Robinson a 32-year-old Steve Smith, a rookie Tony Parker, and Malik Rose that much better than the core of Kenyon Martin, who was in his sophomore season, Kerry Kittles, Keith Van Horn, and a rookie Richard Jefferson? If it is, it ain't by much. But with those legendary players, Tim Duncan led the Spurs to 58 wins for the season, which was tied for the second best record in the league. They were tied with the Lakers, the team that had Shaq and Kobe in their primes. And it's even more impressive that the Spurs won that many games while also playing in the Western Conference, which was 100 times more competitive than the Eastern Conference was. Check out the standings from each conference. As you can see, the West had 5 different teams that won over 50 games. The East only had 2 teams, and they barely won over 50 games. So the fact that the Spurs were able to overachieve that season, with Duncan being the only legitimate scoring threat on the team in a stacked conference, is very impressive. And it surely had a lot to do with the voters ultimately picking Duncan over Kidd to win the MVP. The Spurs having a better season than the Nets while having the same amount of talent is definitely a big factor. But the biggest factor that we have to consider is the type of season that Duncan had. And if we look at the numbers and compare it to what Kidd did that season, it's not really close. Let's look at his numbers. He averaged 25.5 points per game on 51% shooting, 12.7 rebounds per game, 3.7 assists per game, and 2.5 blocks per game. Keep in mind that he averaged a career high in scoring that season. So this was peak Tim Duncan. Now at first glance, you might not be overly impressed by the numbers he put up, but consider this interesting stat. He is only one of 6 players in NBA history to average at least 25 points, 12 rebounds, and 2.5 blocks for a season. The other 5 players, as you can see on your screen, are Kareem, Shaq, Hakeem Olajuwon, David Robinson, and Bob McAdoo. All legendary players. So the fact that he's in that exclusive club of big men is no accident. It's because this was a truly dominant season by Duncan. Now consider this next important stat. For the season, he finished 5th in scoring, 2nd in rebounds, and 4th in blocks. I know that Duncan's per game numbers usually aren't described as dominant, but we can't say that about this season. Duncan was easily the best player in the world, behind Shaq, in my opinion. But those are just his per game numbers. Now let's see Duncan's advanced metrics for the season. On your screen, you'll see what Duncan put up for the season and what Kidd put up. As you all can see, it's not really close. Duncan's numbers are clearly better. He finished first in the league in win shares, offensive win shares, and value over replacement player rating. Not only was he the league leader in those categories, but those were all career highs for him. So as we mentioned before, the greatest power forward of all time was in peak form. That was the competition that Jason Kidd was facing, an all-time great player who had an all-time great season. Here's how we know this. Since the shot clock was implemented, Duncan produced the 31st highest win shares total for a season. In fact, he's just below Steph Curry's legendary 2016 season. He is also only one of 21 players in the history of the league that produced a value over replacement player rating of 8 or higher for a season. So I ask you this, shouldn't all that be good enough for a player to win the MVP award? Now let's take another look at Jason Kidd's numbers one more time. Now I know Kidd's strength was never scoring, but don't you think that scoring average is way too low for a player to win the MVP? If you do, it's for a reason. For example, do you know how rare it is for a player to win the MVP award while averaging less than 15 points per game? There have only been 2 cases in the history of the league. It was Bill Russell in 1965 and Wes Unseld in 1969. In both cases, the players were the ones that were selecting who would win the MVP award, and I believe they were looking to award the best player on the best team than the player with the best individual numbers. But since the NBA/ABA merger, which is what we consider to be the modern NBA, it's never happened. So it's not something that the league rewards, and I don't think it's something that should be rewarded. Not for the most prestigious individual award that a player can obtain in the NBA. So am I trying to say that Jason Kidd didn't have a great season? Absolutely not. When looking back at his basketball legacy, this is always the first season that we bring up, and for good reason. It was amazing how he was able to turn that franchise around and carry that team to the finals. It's one of the reasons why he's one of the greatest point guards of all time. But was it better than the season than what Tim Duncan had? Well, looking at what he accomplished individually and from a team standpoint, we can say that it wasn't. I understand that the media has made some huge mistakes when it comes to selecting the MVP, but this isn't one of those cases. I believe we can say for certain that they got this one right. Well, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in. Till next time.